Narcissism, in the common vernacular, is a silly infatuation with oneself. But when Al Cooper first pulled on that skin-tight yellow PARADAX suit, gazed adoringly at his reflection in the full-length mirror, and whispered, "What's a hunk like you doing in a place like this?" It was more than silly infatuation. It was the real thing. Never before had there been a superhero as good-looking, as self-centered, irreverent, and likable. PARADAX is a modern superhero for the modern 80s, both a product and a reflection of this era. His first thoughts upon gaining preternatural powers are not how he can fight crime and make the world a better place, but how he can really have a good time and become rich and famous and sought after. Of course, this is how anybody like Al, or like most of us, would have thought in any era. PARADAX was just the first superhero to come clean and own up. But even now, the phrase superhero seems too much. All Al wanted was money and fame and sex. Lots of sex. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Comics Rot Your Brain, the show where screenwriters talk about the comic books that we love, mostly from the 1980s. I'm one of your hosts, I'm Steven Bagatourian, and my usual magnificent co-host Chris Derrick is not here with me today because Chris is putting the finishing touches on some very exciting creative work that you will hopefully hear about in the near future. But in the meantime, in between time, I am here to hold down the fort at CRYB Central, and I'm going to be talking with y'all today about one of my absolute favorite cult classics from the 80s, an obscure gem that should not be so obscure because it was so influential and so brilliant and so original and so ahead of its time, a comic called PARADAX from the legendary British creative team of Brendan McCarthy and Pete Milligan. And these guys were a creative dynamo. As a unit, they were a creative powerhouse. These guys were punk rock, surreal, outrageous, pop, lurid, obscene, and brilliant together. They made some of the very most exciting and highly influential comics of the 1980s. We'll probably cover all of their collaborations at some point here on the channel because they're all worth talking about. But for today, I'm going to be talking about PARADAX, and specifically the initial 3 8-page short stories that combined for the inaugural PARADAX arc, if you will. It's really more of a pop single, is kind of how Brendan McCarthy described it at one point. It's only 24 pages, but I'm sure I'm going to have a lot to say about it today because this 24 pages had a seismic impact on both the British comic scene as well as us over the pond here in America. And you'll see why by the time we get to the end of this episode. But it was originally published in an Eclipse Comics anthology title called Strange Days. And Eclipse Comics, of course, was the stalwart American indie comics publisher where you had Kat Ironwood and Dean Mullaney running that ship in a very progressive way where creators were able to largely hold on to the rights to pretty much anything they did for Eclipse. And so you had a lot of just phenomenal creators flocking to Eclipse Comics in the 80s. We've covered some of their titles already here on our channel. Check out our earlier episode that Chris and I did on Saber from Don McGregor and Paul Galassi. That was one of the early Eclipse titles. And Eclipse also would go on to publish Alan Moore and Gary Leach's phenomenal Miracle Man story, which was, of course, Marvel Man in the UK, Miracle Man in the US. And that came out of Eclipse, along with just brilliant work from all kinds of just amazing creators like P. Craig Russell. And I mean, the list goes on and on. Eclipse just published so much great stuff. We'll talk about them more and more on this channel. But Strange Days, the anthology, had a whole bunch of work from Milligan and McCarthy, and it also featured a third strip that was from Milligan and Brett Ewins. And of course, Milligan and Ewins also would go on to collaborate on the super insane British comic, which, well, it was actually an American comic technically, Screamer, which we covered on our channel also, but with an all-British creative team. It was Milligan, Ewins, and then Steve Dillon, who would later go on to do Preacher. They did Screamer, and we have a long ass episode on that. Y'all should go check that out as well. But Strange Days featured 2 collaborations with Milligan and McCarthy. One of them was something called Freakwave, which we'll talk about later at some point. Very psychedelic, very crazy. The other was PARADAX, which we're here to talk about today. And that third collaboration with the aforementioned Brett Ewins, which was in Strange Days, was Johnny Nemo. And we'll talk about that at some point too, because it's another cool thing. But let's discuss PARADAX. Who is PARADAX? What is PARADAX? Why is he even called PARADAX? Is that even a word, PARADAX? Shouldn't it be paradox? Who knows? But what we can say is this is a really unique comic, and it was even more unique when it was first released, because I can tell you it did not look like anything else in comics in the UK or in the US or anywhere else for that matter. In 1984, comics did not look like PARADAX. In particular, superhero comics did not look like PARADAX. Brendan McCarthy is the one obviously responsible for that in completely visually. He was an artist that came to comics with a wide array of influences, drawing from so many sources the comic artists normally do not draw from. And if you watch any interview with Brendan McCarthy online, which I watched a couple to prepare for this, he will invoke all sorts of artists, from Andy Warhol to David Hockney to Max Ernst to Jamie Reed, who designed the Sex Pistols iconography back in the day. He will invoke all kinds of artists as influences, and he'll also evoke movies like The Beatles' Yellow Submarine, or Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, 2001, A Space Odyssey, or The Prisoner TV series. Brendan McCarthy was drawing influences from all across the pop spectrum, and primarily his biggest influence, as he has said, was the music of the 60s through the 90s. So whether it was the Beatles, whether it was T-Rex, David Bowie, Lou Reed, Talking Heads, the Smiths, and on through the Britpop and Manchester scenes over in the 90s in the UK, Oasis, Blur, everything from the 60s through the 90s. Brendan McCarthy's brain and his hands put it into a mad blender, and the work that came out of his hands and his brain was like nothing else that we've seen before or since in the world of comics. Brendan McCarthy is an absolute just explosion of creative energy, and he did a relatively small amount of work in comics, but like other creators like David Mazzucchelli, who left a massive mark on the medium, Brendan McCarthy's influence should be measured not by the quantity of the work he put out, but by the quality. And I would highly recommend that everyone seek out a book called The Best of Milligan and McCarthy that was put out by Dark Horse Comics about a decade ago, and it features the material we're going to be discussing today from the aforementioned Strange Days anthology, at least the Milligan McCarthy parts of it, PARADAX and Freakwave, but it also features all the rest of the brilliant Milligan and McCarthy collaborations, Rogan Gosh, Skin, all of it. It's all there. And if you like what you're seeing in this video today, it's just a taste of the visual extravagance and brilliance of Brendan McCarthy. You should check out that volume from Dark Horse. It's a gorgeous collection of comics. And honestly, it's some of the most mind-blowing work you'll see in the 80s or anywhere in comics. Brendan McCarthy deserves all the love and all the appreciation and all the flowers for that. And at the same time, the guy he was working with, Pete Milligan, was no slouch either. Pete Milligan, we've discussed at length on this channel when we talked about Screamer. And Chris and I were blown away by Screamer. We could not believe that book had not been discussed more and was not more a part of the comics canon and the conversation as it really should be, because Screamer, it was just a completely mind-blowingly disturbing dystopian gangster saga, also highly original. But Milligan's had an extraordinary career in comics. He's written so much stuff. We'd be here all day if we talked about everything that Pete Milligan has written, from Shade the Changing Man to the Ecstatics, to so much of the work that he ultimately did in mainstream comics in the US. He was a contemporary and a peer of folks like Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Jamie Delano. All these guys were part of that British invasion. But Milligan had a very unique flavor to the kind of stories that he was interested in writing and the way he did it. And perhaps one of his signature works, ultimately it was part of the Vertigo checklist of comics that you should check out, Enigma, which he did with the artist Duncan Fegredo. And Enigma is a comic that a lot of creators really love and adore, and it's another one of these highly influential works. I've heard no less a source than Grant Morrison talk about how he likes Enigma better than Watchmen. And so Enigma is another great work from Milligan that everyone should check out. So these guys, they met early on in their lives in art school, I believe, and Milligan and McCarthy, they came together and they started doing comics together. Now, Now, PARADAX actually has some controversy behind it, so we'll talk about the controversy. We'll talk about just everything, and we'll talk about the story itself. There's a lot to talk about here, and I'm a little bit all over the place, but the story itself is also kind of all over the place. It's a wild mishmash of stuff. So we're going to get to everything, but let's talk about the context because we like to do that here on CRYB. We like to give you all some context for these 80s comics, just so you know the milieu that these books were appearing into. Now, part of my premise for doing this episode today is that I believe that the influence of McCarthy and Milligan as a team was so outsized and so just pervasive that it really goes far beyond the amount of sales that any of their relatively, obscure or cult collaborations may have generated, strictly looking at the numbers. But much like other influential artists in the pop world, their influence should not be measured in sales, but rather I think it should be mentioned, or it should be measured rather, in the impact they had on the artists who came after them. And there's another highly influential pop artist, the band Big Star from the 1970s. They're an American rock band that came from Memphis, Tennessee, famously fronted by Alex Chilton. And there was a saying about Big Star, a band. They never achieved huge success in terms of sales or money or any of that, but they went on to just be such a massive influence on bands that were huge, bands like REM and the Replacements and Weezer and just all kinds of bands that went on to become huge, using what they learned and the inspiration that they got from Big Star. And people like to say that Big Star, what's the saying? There's a good saying about this. I'm going to butcher it. But basically, it's that Big Star may have not sold a lot of records, but everyone that bought one of their records went out and formed their own band. That's basically the saying. I'm paraphrasing, but I've heard that said multiple times. And I feel like that same thought, that same idea could apply to Milligan and McCarthy, and just how highly influential what they did was. And one of their biggest fans, as we'll find out here, was indeed Grant Morrison. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here because there's a little bit of controversy around that exact issue. Okay, so why don't we start off now, just to set the table and give some context for all this, with reading a quick review of The Best of Milligan and McCarthy, that Dark Horse collection that I mentioned, coming from Douglas Wolk, who's one of our smartest writers about comics. And Douglas put out this book, I think just a couple years ago, called All the Marvels, where he apparently read every single Marvel comic ever done in history, which I find so inconceivable that it blows my mind. And far be it from me to call Douglas a liar. I believe he did it. I am just in awe of the way that anyone could find the time to read every Marvel comic ever published. But you can look up that book. It's an astonishing premise, and apparently he did it. And I haven't read the book, but I would be very curious what happened to Douglas Wolk after reading every Marvel comic ever published. Honestly, I want to study his time management skills and also his speed reading skills, because I don't think I could read every Marvel comic ever published if you gave me the rest of my life and I got to devote every day to it. So I'm completely blown away by Douglas Wolk, but he's also just beyond all that. He's a terrific writer about comics, and he wrote this review 11 years ago for the Washington Post on this Dark Horse collection. So let's hear what he had to say about The Best of Milligan and McCarthy. Between 1978 and 1990, two Brits, Milligan and McCarthy, collaborated on a string of bizarre and wonderful comics, most of which are collected in this oversized volume from Dark Horse. We felt we were fine artists doing comics, they note, seeing what we could get away with, bending the rules of what was possible. They both attended art school in London just as punk rock was revolutionizing the country's youth culture, all of which is obvious from their first collaboration, The Electric Hoax, a freeform weekly strip created for the music newspaper Sounds, involving messy caricatures of the Sex Pistols. The duo hit their stride with projects such as PARADAX, which we are, of course, discussing right now, and Freakwave, in which McCarthy adopted a visual style that was even freakier and louder than the weirdest pulp comics he'd grown up on, and Milligan crammed the panels with text that reads like a vulgar mashup of Stan Lee and Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. Coherence was never the team's strong suit. Their Rogan Gosh, a psychedelic salute to the intersection of British and Indian culture, abruptly changes direction every few pages. But they were committed to punk immediacy, to hyper-vivid surrealism and to smashing formulas, even their own. The infamous Skin is a gruesomely violent story about a thalidomide deformed skinhead in early 1970s England, and its pastel colors by Carol Swain provide the one sustained exception here to the eye-popping, super-saturated tones that McCarthy favors. After spending years rejecting the idea that comics should look like movies, Brendan McCarthy actually moved on to a career in film and TV design and has occasionally returned to drawing comics, including last year's peculiar miniseries, The Saucer of Zilk. And I should note here, for the record, that Brendan McCarthy is perhaps most famous in his career in the world at large for his work in film and TV, where he has done design work and sort of conceptual work for all manner of very high profile projects, including the revolutionary TV series Reboot, which I think was a very early sort of adopter of CGI animation, pushed all kinds of boundaries. And of course, most famously, Brendan McCarthy collaborated with none other than George Miller, the Australian filmmaking genius behind the Mad Max films. And it was because of Brendan McCarthy that we got to see Mad Max Fury Road. He co-wrote the screenplay with George Miller, and he was intimately involved in doing the production design, conceptual art, and just basically collaborated on the whole film and helped bring it to life with George Miller. So Brendan McCarthy is a multi-medium, multi-threat creative genius who has worked, all across the spectrum of TV, film, and comics. But what we are most interested in here today is his early work in comics, because, this show is not called Movies Rot Your Brain, and it's not called TV Rots Your Brain. We have a focus specifically on comics. But just wanted to note that for the record, if you've seen Mad Max Fury Road, then you should really give a big thank you to Brendan McCarthy and, buy him a beer next time you see him in the pub, because I think that film would not have happened without his passion and his belief in the material. So back to this review from Douglas Wolk, though. So McCarthy moved on to a career in TV and film, but he's occasionally returned to drawing comics, including the peculiar miniseries, which I believe he did for Boom, The Saucer of Zilk. Pete Milligan went on to write the left-of-center superhero series Shade the Changing Man, Ecstatics. He also had long runs on X-Men and, lots of high-profile stuff. Wrote a ton of stuff for Vertigo. He wrote a crazy series called Egypt. He wrote a book called Greek Street. He did just a ton of stuff. Like, we could be here forever listing his credits. But Douglas Wolk concludes the review by saying that the stories that Milligan and McCarthy created together are lurid and blunt and ragged around the edges, but decades after their first appearance, most of them still look like they've been beamed in from another world. Amen. Yes, they do. And if you're looking at the visuals here, you see exactly what Douglas Wolk's talking about. These are fucking original, weird, bright pop candy confections, punk rock idea bombs exploding in your eyes and mouth. These are just wild ass comics. They are pure comics. These are things that could not exist in any other medium. Milligan and McCarthy were just reinventing the formula of comics at that time, and the impact was formidable. So now, before we get into the page-by-page breakdown and discussion of the whole series, I think it's worth noting that there's a bit of controversy surrounding PARADAX and the just what happened surrounding PARADAX, because the fact that it did have a big influence was not necessarily noted immediately. And one of the comics that PARADAX was most highly and directly influential on was a strip that would run in the very high-profile British comic weekly, 2000 AD, and this came out later, years later. There was a strip called PARADAX, which was created by none other than Grant Morrison and Steve Yowell. And at least those were the creators who did the strip itself. However, there was a backstory to ZENITH and its connection to PARADAX, which was sort of unknown. And, for people who were carefully observing things in the British comic scene at the time, you would notice that the character of ZENITH did bear a striking visual similarity to PARADAX, in the sense that he was a kind of a hip-looking, kind of rock star-looking superhero with a familiar sort of like hairdo and, a kind of a pompadour, sort of a, just unique kind of rock star hairdo. And with the spandex, he also had a cool rock and roll leather jacket on over the spandex, which is not something superheroes ever really wore before PARADAX. So Zenith came out a couple of years later, looking awfully similar. And, if anyone noticed, I don't know that a lot of people talked about it, but we have here an article from The Beat, Heidi McDonald's comics culture blog, wherein about a decade ago, we had a journalist over there, Laura Snedden, who back in 2013 was doing an article on Zenith and the history of this comic. And in the comments section, none other than Brendan McCarthy himself chimed in to sort of set the record straight. And I think it's valuable and it's worth us talking about here today to set the proper context before we look at PARADAX. We just want to set the table for a little bit of the drama surrounding this here, because personally, I'm a big Anglophile when it comes to the comic book scene and also the music scene. And I spent a lot of time myself in England when I was in my teens, because my sister happened to marry a brilliant English filmmaker who was also a huge comic book geek and an awesome guy. And I spent a lot of summers over there going to English comic book shops and reading English, music magazines, and I read a lot of NME and Melody Maker and Select and Q, and I read a lot of Deadline and a lot of Speakeasy and all these comics magazines that you'd get at the newsagent, and stuff like Toxic and Blast and things that were short lived. But I was really into like the weekly British comic scene, of course, 2000 AD, and I fell in love. I'd already fallen in love with a lot of the British writers at the time, but Grant Morrison, Alan Moore, these guys were fast becoming my favorite writers when I was in my teens. And I would become increasingly fascinated by how the British comic scene had a lot of drama inherent in it, which is perhaps to be expected for any kind of small scene where there's limited job opportunities and, everyone's going to have a little bit of a crabs in a bucket kind of mentality. But the craziest thing to me has been just the lasting beef, so to speak, between Alan Moore and Grant Morrison, arguably, or perhaps not even arguably, the two biggest British writers of all time, who seem to kind of sort of hate each other and talk about it publicly at length. And you can read articles on that elsewhere. But even here, as we'll find out, there's a little controversy between Grant Morrison and the creation of Zenith and its relation to PARADAX too. And it's all just fascinating. And in talking about this, I certainly don't have any ill will toward anyone, and I'm not trying to kick a hornet's nest, but I just think it's interesting to note for the record just some of these historical discussions of who created what and who did what, where, and when. And I think probably all the creators at this point, hopefully, could have a good laugh about a lot of this stuff, because they're all legends. They're all super successful, and hopefully most of this is all water under the bridge, because it's all comics, and ultimately everything at the end of the day, it is what it is. But the British comic scene at times may remind one of the gangster rap scene and the hip hop scene, and how much beef there is between creators. But let's find out what Brendan McCarthy says here about Grant Morrison and the connection to PARADAX and Zenith. And again, as I say all this, Grant Morrison's The Invisibles is perhaps my favorite comic story of all time. So I love Grant Morrison, and everyone's got their own version of the truth. So keep that in mind as I read Brendan's comments here, which I also have no reason to disbelieve. It's just fascinating. But so in this article that was written, in the comments section, Brendan McCarthy chimes in to talk a little bit about the history, in his memory, of Zenith. So he starts his comment by saying, very good article or articles. It's a series of articles on Zenith, he says to Laura Snedden, the journalist. And he goes on to say, as you weren't around in the 80s and privy to actually what was really going on back then with that small bunch of people who were blazing a trail in the British comics industry, let me add a few insights. Back in the day, the only new thoughts, I suppose, the only new thoughts on superheroes were from Alan Moore in his version of Marvel Man. I didn't particularly like the strip. This is Brendan talking here. I didn't particularly like the strip, finding it a continuation of the wordy, purple Don McGregor school of writing, and I wanted to make my own new statement about the superhero concept. So I invented PARADAX in the early 80s and asked the question, what would it be like if an ordinary guy down the road became a superhero? Which, over 30 years ago, was a fairly novel approach. He would drink, smoke pot, fuck girls, watch himself being interviewed on TV, be an annoying, self-infatuated asshole obsessed with stardom, have a manager, and take the money and run. I designed PARADAX with a big, exaggerated Superman-esque quiff for hair and based his look a bit on the 60s Kid Flash. I then added street clothing, as I figured that realistically he would look like a dick wandering about in a skin-tight yellow outfit. This was all light years from Alan Moore's grim and gritty take, and PARADAX was the only other version of a superhero coming out of the UK at the time. This is some years before Zenith. I fleshed out the storyline and took it to Peter Milligan to write the script. Pete knew almost nothing about superheroes, and that was appealing to me, as he had no reverence for the genre. PARADAX appeared in Strange Days 1 through 3 and was our only attempt at a superhero. In tone, it was throwaway, sexy, breezy, a bit like a catchy pop single disguising a big fuck-off statement, like the Sex Pistols singles. Strange Days was a bit left field from the straighter 2000 AD world, and soon the groovier people in comics, like Grant Morrison, were gravitating over to our scene rather than the Alan Moore school of comics scene at Warrior. Warrior, of course, was another highly formative, influential British comics magazine, which gave birth to such incredible series as, of course, Marvel Man, but also Alan Moore's other giant series at the time, V for Vendetta with David Lloyd, and Warrior was edited by Des Skin, who was a major figure in the UK comic scene as well at the time. And yeah, it made just a massive mark on comics, and we'll probably talk about Warrior at some point on this channel here. But so, as Brendan's outlining here, there were two different schools of comics in the UK, which is fascinating to note, and that the Alan Moore school was over at Warrior, and that was kind of the base for that. And then he goes on to say Grant Morrison was besotted with our stuff, as it was a totally new and original manifesto for what comics could be, and a vital part of the 80s British invasion in the USA. We talked comics and movies, and above all, music, at many a gathering. Okay? And just to emphasize to everyone, the UK comic scene, it's a small thing. It was a small thing at the time, and it's a small place. And so at this time, this was a very small group of creators who would, of course, see each other at conventions, see each other at the pub, see each other all around. And of course, their work is going to influence each other, because there's just, it's a small place geographically, and there's not that many people doing comics. And it's the 80s, which, as we've talked about a lot on this channel, is just ground zero for so much reinvention and reimagining of what comics could be. And so it makes perfect sense that these guys are all bouncing off each other and inspiring each other. So McCarthy goes on in his comment here to say, Grant approached me to draw the Zenith strip that he was pitching to 2000 AD, and initially I was quite interested. I designed a bunch of characters from his pitch, but as I read the full scripts later on, I saw that he was lifting quite a lot from PARADAX. The other story elements in Zenith, apart from the PARADAX-inspired media superbrat stuff, seemed like the usual comics fare, super soldiers, and all that magic / Doctor Who stuff he was into. And that's magic with a CK, folks, of the Aleister Crowley variety. Brendan goes on to say, yeah, that all bored me, as I'd heard it all before. I couldn't see the upside of illustrating a strip that was essentially ripping off my own original thought, so I passed on drawing it. Let me stress that Steve Yowell drew it far better than I would have. His work was really good, and he was absolutely the right guy for the job. All right, and then let me just say, stepping away from Brendan's comment, that's a very classy thing for Brendan to say toward his fellow comic artist, Steve Yowell. Very, very classy. Nice of him to throw that in there. Okay, back to the comment. When I see it written that Zenith was some sort of brand new take on superheroes, the first of the celebrity superbrats, etc., well, I do tend to spit out my coffee. Even the magical stuff in Zenith was not original. 2000 AD had to pay off some artist for having his stuff ripped off later on in the series. I'm not sure what he's referencing there, but that's what the comment says. I liked some of the later ones with Robot Archie, etc. I think he's talking about the later episodes, the later volumes of Zenith. I like some of the later ones when it got a bit more surreal and more of its own thing. It was fun. Zenith is a pretty good strip, but it is derivative of my own PARADAX material. There is a greatest hits collection of my 80s work coming out, the best of Milligan and McCarthy. Of course, he's referencing this book here from this comment because that was right around the time where it did come out. And he says, it includes the PARADAX strips. You can have a look and make up your own mind. Note the dates and that one strip preceded the other. One's the original, one's the version. I never produced much stuff in comics. I was a very slow artist, and eventually I moved on to TV and film as I got bored with drawing these influential strips that were picked clean for ideas. My stuff never sold in huge amounts, and I felt I said what I had to say in comics, and I wanted some new creative challenges and to make some money. Fair, right? Yeah, that's pretty fair. He concludes his comment. It's a very long comment, but he concludes it by saying, around that time, Grant asked me to design stuff for Kill Krull Crew, I think it was called. I believe it was actually the Skrull Kill Crew that he's referencing here, which was a miniseries about the Skrulls that Grant Morrison did for Marvel at some point. So he says, Grant asked me to design stuff for that and Doom Patrol, which Grant Morrison, of course, famously wrote for DC after Grant wrote his legendary run on Animal Man. Grant went on to do a legendary run on Doom Patrol, which had the most exquisite Simon Bisley covers, some of the best comic book covers of all time, just as a side note. So here, Brendan says he did a lot of the original designs for Doom Patrol. And then maybe a year later, Grant bumped into him at a British comic convention. And he mentioned that Grant said he was having trouble coming up with a good headquarters for the team. They chatted and they laughed and they talked about it. And he goes on in his comment here, Brendan does, to say that he is the one who came up with the idea for Danny the Street, who ended up becoming one of the more popular ideas / characters in Doom Patrol. And Brendan saying here it was his idea. And then he says, curiously, that Grant subsequently claimed that he invented Danny the Street himself while walking backwards around Paris in a situationist hash trance or something. And Brendan concludes, and that's annoying to me, as he can't admit that what many consider to be the best idea in Doom Patrol wasn't his. You need to take what Grant says about Zenith and his earlier career with a pinch of salt. There's a lot of revisionist legend buffing going on. Some of us were actually there. So, yowza. That's quite a comment from Brendan McCarthy here in this article. And Laura Snedden, the journalist, responds and says, thanks, Brendan. I'm both glad and relieved that you've liked the articles thus far. And Laura says, you're quite right about the history revisionism, which seems to be happening all around. And she also compliments PARADAX and says good things about it. And she's hoping it'll get more attention, being republished, blah, blah, blah. And she says, thanks for clearing some stuff up. Much appreciated. And then Heidi McDonald, the founder of The Beat, chimes in to say, man, I love Strange Days. Thanks for writing in, Brendan. And then a whole bunch of people chime in the comments to talk about how much they love PARADAX and how they don't understand how it's been so forgotten and lost to the sands of history and all that. So there's some more context for you. That's pretty wild. Comics is a fucking madhouse, people. There's just nothing but drama everywhere in comics. The deeper you get into comics, everyone's got beef. And it makes sense because whether it's in the UK or whether it's in the US, it's a very intimate, small industry. There's not enough money. People aren't appreciated enough. The few people who do make it, tend to make it out really big, and you get your occasional, your Todd McFarlanes, your Robert Kirkmans, and the people who, launch into the stratosphere and make billions of dollars. But usually, they have people that they may or may not have stepped on their way getting there. Just, there's always drama. So just good to note for the record, because we are a historical podcast. And while we don't take any sides, we are here to report what has happened and what people have reported on and discussed elsewhere. And we will, of course, be covering Grant Morrison later on this channel, because like I said, Grant's one of my favorite writers of all time. And so, I'm not bothered by the beef or even by the controversy, because ultimately, the art is the art. And let's say now, as we get into PARADAX, there's a whole lot we can discuss. And there's another great article that I think we can close with. But for now, let's just talk about the actual story of PARADAX, and let's talk about what's happening in the story itself, because there's not that much to it. The story feels like a bit of a trifle, if I'm being honest, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's quite intentional. So As we come in on Paradox, we have the story of Al Cooper here, and I can just read directly from the text from Pete Milligan, which is a far cry from the purple prose that Brendan McCarthy was saying he disliked so much for Alan Moore. This Pete Milligan, this kind of text on Paradox is quite poppy and pithy and quick. We start off and it says, this is the story of a guy called Al Cooper, a city called New York, and an enigma called PARADAX by Milligan and McCarthy. PARADAX with an exclamation point. And we set up the story at the beginning. We're at a bar, and the text says, this is Murphy's Bar in Midtown Manhattan. You might know it. You might even drink there yourself. If you do, you'll know it's the classiest joint this side of the Bowery. I mean, it caters to only the most sophisticated customers. And for those of you who can't quite hear the irony there, that's very ironic. And we see a kind of a hillbilly-looking cowboy type looking at our hero Al Cooper, who's drinking here, looking like a little bit of a rock and roll kind of a David Bowie-esque figure at the bar. And you got this hillbilly cowboy guy who's staring at him. And he's reading a newspaper that's titled Daily Lies. And the newspaper says, it's got a headline, front page says, Al Cooper is Paradax. And the cowboy's sitting right next to Al Cooper himself, drinking a beer. And the cowboy says, hey, scumbag, your name Cooper? Al Cooper? And Al Cooper lights a cigarette and says, nah, it's Ronald Reagan. 1984, people. Very, very timely. He says, nah, it's Ronald Reagan. What's it to you, cowboy? And the cowboy says, your front page news, Cooper, or should I say, Paradax. And Al Cooper says, shit, Chow's blown the whole story. And as we're going to find out later, he's talking about his manager, Mr. Chow, who is honestly a bit of a problematic character created by Milligan and McCarthy here. But we can get into that and talk about that a little later. But so, Cooper looks at the headline, and then the cowboy raises a fist to his face and says, hero my ass, take away your fancy suit, and you're just a pretty boy with a haircut. And Al Cooper says, bug off, cowboy. And we cut before the fist is going to meet his face. But we know the fist did meet his face because we cut to Al Cooper back at home in his apartment sometime later, where his very pretty punk rock girlfriend, Copper Keene, who's got pink hair, is just sitting on Al's back, giving him a massage. And we see that Al's got a bandage across the bridge of his nose from the fight he just got into at the bar, which we have skipped past, but he got his ass beat. And back at the apartment, Al's getting the massage to make him feel better from his girl, Copper. And they got a cat. They got an orange cat sitting on the bed next to them. And it's a very messy, very bohemian, small little New York apartment. And Al says, man, I was just lulling that redneck into a false of security, Copper. There's a few typos from the letterer here in this Paradox. I believe that should be a false sense of security, but whatever. Punk rock comics got typos. I think it's cool. Whatever. And then Copper says, save it, Al. You never got into barroom brawls before this Paradox thing took off. Why do you have to be so friggin' dumb, Al? I mean, why'd you let Mr. Chow tell the press who you are, for Christ's sakes? And Al says, first thing I knew about it was when that Neanderthal man in Murphy started dancing on my windpipe. So we're kind of being thrown into the middle of the story here. And, Copper is actually taking her shirt off, getting naked, and then goes back to massaging Al some more. So it is pretty sexy, risque comics for the time, especially. And we also find out here that the story is going to be mixing things up in terms of a chronological fashion, because although the story is a relatively just simple, like I say, a trifle of a story, the one thing that Milligan does have a bit of fun with as a writer is the chronology, and we end up having 3 separate time frames that the story is taking place in over the scant 24 pages that it covers. And I actually read the story twice to make sure that I was taking it all in. And the second time I read it, I was like, yep, not a lot really happens, but we still got 3 time frames. And the 3 time frames essentially are, you've got Al hanging out with Copper as they're watching a TV show, which we're about to start seeing, where Al is being interviewed by none other than Andy Warhol, who was still alive, just barely at the time that Paradox came out, and was soon to be assassinated, sadly. But one of these time frames, Copper and Al are watching him as a superhero, Paradox, being interviewed by Andy Warhol on Andy Warhol's talk show, because Al is like, he's the toast of the town as a superhero. And that's one thing that's very prescient about Paradox, because Paradox came out before Rob Liefeld's Youngblood, and of course came out before Grant Morrison's Zenith. It came out before any of these other sort of collisions of pop culture with like media horror superheroes. And today we'd call Paradox a clout chaser. We'd call him kind of a social media influencer slash superhero. But none of these phrases or ideas existed back in 1984. But McCarthy and Milligan were extremely prescient, seeing the way the culture was going, and honestly, Paradox is decades ahead of its time in terms of a comic and a concept. And, like Chris and I have discussed on this show, not infrequently, it's sort of cold comfort when you're way ahead of your time as an artist. Because although you can look back and be like, yeah, look at that, I was brilliant, I saw the way culture was going and I called it in my work. But almost always, if you're ahead of your time as an artist, that means you're by definition going to be a bit of a cult artist, because most people just aren't going to get what you're doing yet. And it'll only be in retrospect that they will. But at that point, you've been broke for 20 years and you've had to leave the medium to go make money somewhere else, which is why it's cold comfort, but it is what it is. And so, anyways, like I say, Paradox taking place in 3 time frames. It's Al and Copper watching. So that's one time frame. They're in the apartment after the massage. They start watching TV, and on the TV is Al being interviewed, obviously from an earlier time period, by Andy Warhol. So we got him on the TV, and then on the TV, Andy Warhol's asking him about the origin of how he became the superhero Paradox, which takes us into the origin story as Al is relating to Andy Warhol on the chat show, which is then being watched by Copper and Al. And this sounds more confusing than it is, but it's really the one sort of literary thing that Pete Milligan's doing that's a bit complex here. But other than that, the story feels like it's a fairly simple story for Milligan, and knowing how ambitious and complex a lot of Pete Milligan stories would become later, this is, it's a relatively, fun, light story for Pete Milligan. And so the only other time frame that we're going to find here soon, which will begin in the second issue, is Milligan and McCarthy detailing how Paradox goes up against his first supervillain, who is a very unusual character, and he goes up against him after going out on patrol in his costume for the first time and getting made fun of. And Al Cooper decides he wants to be a superhero because he found a costume in his taxi cab. And this is what he relates to Warhol. He was a taxi cab driver, and somebody left a magical book that said Paradox on it and had some sort of like magical glyph on it. He opened up the book, has a compartment in it with a yellow costume that does look very kind of Kid Flash-like, and he pulls the costume out and he puts it on, looks pretty awesome, and as soon as he puts it on, he's able to start phasing through solid matter a la Kitty Pryde from the X-Men, aka Shadowcat. And so that's the power. He starts phasing through things, not quite sure how to control the power, but he is sure he wants to monetize it. Again, very prescient. He doesn't really want to be a hero for any particular reason other than he wants to get laid, get money, get girls, and become famous. And it's a very realistic approach to suddenly getting superpowers. He doesn't become a saint. He's still himself. He just wants to be a fucking awesome, fun, successful, shallow version of who he is with superpowers, and be famous and rich, and have people just lining up to be with him. So that sounds pretty believable for a young crazy person who gets superpowers, right? And so that's part of the innovation of Paradox. And this final time frame of the story is Paradox really deciding to go out superheroing. In the midst of this, his boss from the taxi cab company, the aforementioned Mr. Chow, gets him to sign a contract to become his manager. And this is sort of the one unfortunate aspect of Paradox that I should touch on here. Mr. Chow is indeed a negative racial stereotype of a Chinese American character, and he's obsessed only with money and ripping off Al. And it's a shame. It's a bit of an unfortunate stain on the story of Paradox, which is otherwise a really fun wacky story, but it's it's an undeniably xenophobic slash racist stereotype of an Asian character, in this case a Chinese American, whose entire character is defined by being a conniving, wily, sort of dishonest, crafty character, just ripping off Al, and ultimately getting his comeuppance from a good old-fashioned American hillbilly cowboy at the end. So it's a shame. It's a shame, and I hate to have to report that to y'all, but I feel like it would be dishonest and not right if I skipped over it. And, certainly we could say that you could say it's a product of the time, but I think that's not entirely fair either, because it's not like this was in the 1950s. It was in 1984, and not every writer was trafficking in stereotypes like this at that time. So I think that's an unfortunate thing, frankly, and it's made doubly unfortunate by the fact that Screamer, the other book that we covered from Milligan and Ewins, also had a really weird sort of racial situation with the one black character in Screamer named Dutch, as I recall, who is horrifically tortured in that comic in a way that is so gruesome and so crazy. And is so emasculating. He has a cage on his face while he's crucified, and then a rat is let into the cage to eat off his face while he's being essentially crucified and tortured. I mean, it's like one of the more graphic and gruesome bits of torturing ever in a mainstream comic, and it happened to the one black character in Screamer. So all that's unfortunate, and I don't say any of that to assassinate the character of Pete Milligan, because I actually think he's an extremely gifted writer, and I've not read the entire run of Shade the Changing Man, but I've always wanted to, and I'm sure I will one day. And nor have I read everything that Pete Milligan's written, but I feel like we have to report on things honestly on this channel, and especially when reporting on the 80s, we do run across things that are sexist, we run across things that are racist, we run across things that are just not cool by today's standards, and frankly, we're not cool by the standards of the 80s either. And so we are going to comment on these things, but we're also not going to avoid a book entirely because it has something like that there in it. We're going to assess it in proper context. We're going to note it, which we just did, and then move on. And hopefully the rest of the Milligan stories that we read or discuss on this channel will not have those kind of problematic characterizations in them. I'm hoping that Enigma does not, because I really do want to look at Enigma soon because of how well regarded it is by so many people that I respect. So, having noted that, let's move forward to the bad guy that PARADAX takes on in the story, who is a guy who is a bizarre, wacky bad guy who's built like a fucking tank, and he's got hands that are literally missile warheads, and he's an incredibly surreal guy. Looks like he's wearing a giant checkered suit, like he escaped from I don't know where he escaped from, a mental asylum or a ska concert, but he looks bizarre. He's got these giant pink sunglasses. He looks like he's 500 pounds, and he's got these, like I say, missile warheads on his hands. And his name is V2 Pinhead, and he's basically this guy who's intent on destroying the world, and he actually breaks into a mental asylum where he finds a scientist working on a formula for something called Minutemen, which are sort of like sea monkeys, but it's like a formula where he's basically creating these instant Minutemen soldiers that will appear within a minute, and you can make thousands of them instantly. And he steals the formula from this scientist, and then he takes this formula and he's going off to do bad things with it. And wait, hold on. Pinhead, he escapes from a mental asylum. Okay, I just want to get this backstory straight. He escapes from the top security wing for the criminally insane at the New York State Mental Asylum, but then, he steals the formula for the Minutemen from someone who's a German scientist elsewhere in the Lower East Side in a private apartment building. Okay, so I was conflating those two locations, but it's really, he comes from the mental asylum to the Lower East Side, finds this German scientist who he murders in a gruesome fashion, steals the formula for the Minutemen, and he's got an evil plan, which we're going to find out about. Okay, now back to a police station in New York where Al Cooper, aka PARADAX, phases into the police station. He gets a report about this terrible bad guy, V2 Pinhead, and what he's just done. And our guy, Al Cooper, somehow, even though he's new at superheroing, he puts it all together instantly. And I think it's because we need him to, because it's the end of chapter 2, frankly. So he says to the cop, "Hey, even a dumbo like me can see it ain't no coincidence the Pinhead escaped just before the peace convention and knew where to go to find the Minutemen. How many ex-CIA boys are in the New York mental asylum?" And then the cop says, "Off the record, about 24." And Al Cooper, aka PARADAX, says, "One of them must have given Pinhead the info." He says, "Look, these banks he's robbing are just a smokescreen. The peace assembly, that's his real target." And we find out there's a huge peace assembly happening in New York. The United Nations has every major national leader attending for what's going to be a total arms freeze conference, and hopes are high. And so Al Cooper puts all this together and he says, "Pinhead wants to slaughter all the national leaders. He wants full-scale global war." And then Al thinks to himself, "Geez, what a scream." And then quite amusingly, at the end of this chapter too, the the little next lettering at the bottom of the last page says, "Coming up next, PARADAX wins!" Exclamation point. Which I think is just kind of hysterical because, of course, that's what's going to happen in the final chapter. What else would happen? So we get to the final chapter, and Al's just, hanging around his shitty apartment wearing Speedos, drinking cheap fizzy beer with his mostly naked, pretty punk rock girlfriend. Again, she's like, "Christ, Al, why do you got to be such a slob?" He's like, "Dunno, copper." Their cat is hanging out next to them. And, Al now has got to go confront the bad guy. He's got to go confront V2 Pinhead. And he finds out his manager, Mr. Chow, has been selling tickets. And he's got the cable networks there, the satellite. And Mr. Chow here says, "We got cable, satellite, the lot. They're throwing bucks at us like bloody confetti." And and then he goes on to say, "This Pinhead, he's an un-American crazy weirdo. He doesn't give a damn about money." And so, and that's in response to PARADAX saying, "Well, can you pay this guy to take a dive in round 2?" And Mr. Chow's like, "No, Pinhead's crazy. You don't give a shit about money." One thing that's weird about Mr. Chow, aside from the, racist caricature of him, is that he's purportedly Chinese American, but he's talking like he's English, which is, I think, a fault in the characterization from Milligan. Above and beyond the larger problem here, the dialogue is just not believable for a Chinese American, character here. He's saying, "We got cable, satellite, the lot. They're throwing bucks at us like bloody confetti." This is always one of the amusing things that I find charming whenever the English writers, whenever the British invasion would write American comics, there would always be some Britishisms that would kind of sneak through. And frankly, I find this comforting because the British writers of that era were so goddamn smart and so much better than the vast majority of American writers that I actually find it really reassuring when you're reading comics by Alan Moore or Grant Morrison, or in this case, Pete Milligan. And there are frequently little Britishisms, stuff like the lot or bloody, or they talk about queuing up somewhere and, a news agent and just shit like that would slip through the American editors somehow, because the editors are asleep at the wheel in comics apparently half the time. But it would always make me feel better because the British writers were so fucking good that the level of their writing was intimidating in large part, particularly when you're reading stuff by Alan Moore that just felt so crystalline and well thought out and perfect, that, yeah, I actually like it that they fuck up the dialogue and that they fuck up the language sometimes, because it reminds me that these guys are human and they were not, they were not perfect writers, which is good, So then basically PARADAX confronts this crazy Pinhead character. They have a big showdown. The guy, Pinhead, is like, "You're a despicable, soft, boiled, stool-faced liberal. Prepare to feel the hardness of Pinhead." And, there's some kind of political thought going on here. And the fact that Pinhead keeps talking about how hard he is. And then Al goes to punch him. And then he says, "Yow! Oh my God, geez, this goon really is hard." And then Pinhead goes to punch PARADAX, and there's some kind of cool symmetry in the fact that Pinhead is the ultimate hard bad guy, and Al is like completely the opposite of hard. Literally, like when he's using his powers, you can't touch him. He phases right through matter. So there's some kind of like, unity of opposites there going on. So Milligan, as always, is a thoughtful writer. So even in his trifle of a story here, he's got some things going on under the surface that are that are, that are compelling, that are intriguing at the very least. There is some thought here. And so Paradox ultimately takes out Pinhead. It's a weird kind of funny idea for how he does it. He blows some of this Minutemen powder into Pinhead's face, and Pinhead ends up swallowing it. And once he swallows this like crazy powder, the clever part about this is that the powder interacts and reacts to Pinhead's bodily fluids, and suddenly these super soldiers explode. These Minutemen explode out of Pinhead's body from his innards, basically destroying him in a giant, crazy full-page splash page, where it's just like pop, 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 and all these soldiers just start popping out of him from inside as these Minutemen, again, picture like sea monkeys that when they're hydrated, instead of being like weird little whatever sea monkeys are, they turn into actual little soldiers that look like they came out of a freaking Jack Kirby war comic, and they've got big lantern jaws, and they're all smoking cigars, and they got helmets on, and they look identical, but there's like a zillion of them just popping out of Pinhead from the inside, destroying him and just like ripping his body to ribbons, and it's ugly and gross. And then we come out of that scene and we realize that Al has just told that story to Andy Warhol, and he's like, yep, they was still fishing bits of the creep out of the Hudson 2 weeks later. Anyway, so the peace talks went ahead. They only lasted 5 minutes, though. No one could agree on the seating arrangements. Everyone pieced off home. And that's the end of the interview on the Andy Warhol show. And we go back to Copper and Al watching it half naked in their shitty apartment. And they come out and whatchamacallit, Copper says, oh, you should have torn a strip off that lowlife Chow, which is probably some kind of British expression too, I guess. Torn a strip of skin off him, I guess. I assume that's what she means. Whatever it is, sounds violent. And we see a nice shot of Al Cooper's ass from behind and wearing his Speedo as he says, screw Chow. Some of the angles that Brendan McCarthy is choosing here are just wild, because this particular angle, this panel, we're just seeing nothing but both characters' panties while they're talking to each other, and they're like barely there panties. And so, this is like very, very risque for comics in the 80s, particularly a superhero comic, and quite obviously intentionally so. And so Al Cooper, Paradox, says he's going back to Murphy's Bar. We're coming full circle at the end of our 24 pages here, and he's going to go give, Chow a piece of his mind. He gets there and he confronts Mr. Chow for selling his secret identity to the press. Mr. Chow says, it's called business, Cooper. And suddenly that same cowboy from the opening shows up, and the cowboy seems to somehow very quickly and conveniently intuit that Mr. Chow is ripping off Al. Might be a bit of a racist assumption also on this cowboy's part, but the cowboy says, say, scumball, what's this crap you're giving my buddy about a contract? And Mr. Chow says, no crap, mister, I'm Paradox's manager. And the cowboy dude says, listen, meathead, get your ass out of here. If you bug Paradox again, they'll be serving you up as takeout. And oof. Okay, that's a little bit of a problematic insult from the cowboy as well, but okay, whatever, it's a character. And he says, okay, cowboy, to hell with bloody superheroes. So Chow, again, with sort of the comment that makes no sense coming from an American manager, but whatever. Okay. No one said this was a perfect comic. So that's the end of Mr. Chow. And we got Al and Copper at the bar. And geez, ain't every day you get to rip up a bum contract. And, the cowboy's like, he's there. And he's like, cool. All right, buddy. And they're pals again. And they talk about another adventure Paradox has had, apparently. And they say, hey, that's another story. They're having a drink. All is well at the bar. And that's the end of our tale. Paradox 24 jam-packed pages, originally published in Strange Days. Paradox made a brief return to the comic book scene a couple of years later when the Canadian indie publishing outfit Vortex Comics, which was a publisher founded by Bill Marks and his wife, Deborah Marks. And they were best known for putting out such titles as Yummy Fur and other stuff. What else did Paradox? What else did whatchamacallit, Vortex put out? Oh yeah, Howard Chaykin's Black Kiss. Vortex was a very, and of course Mr. X, which we covered on this channel as well. Vortex was an unusual publisher in comics. Like I say, they're out of Canada, and they revived Paradox for two brief issues, two color issues that had really pretty awesome looking covers, as I recall. Really just beautifully designed McCarthy covers on the Vortex issues, which we're not covering here today. The first Vortex issue was an original Paradox story, and the second issue was simply a republishing of the 24 pages from the 3 issues of Strange Days, which had broken up Paradox into 3 8-page installments, which is all of what we just covered. It was republished in that second issue out of Vortex, and for some reason the colors were redone, and I've seen the colors on that republished Vortex edition. I think they look terrible by comparison to the original colors, so I'm not sure what happened there. I'm not sure if McCarthy actually preferred the redone colors in the Vortex edition. I can't imagine he did, but maybe, I mean, I don't know, or maybe just Bill Marks and Vortex decided to recolor it for some reason. I have no clue. Weird shit happens in comics all the bloody time. All right. And okay, so having said all that, that's the story for what it's worth. It's really original, and if you're looking at the images, it's super fun to look at. It's such a well-drawn story. I'm just blown away by Brendan McCarthy's visual sense. And it's really just, it's a crime in comics how many brilliant creators just leave the medium for lack of attention, lack of money, etc. I'm a huge hip hop fan too, and it reminds me of just how some of my favorite rappers leave hip hop for similar reasons, and we just don't get enough work from people like Mos Def, or today known as Yassine Bey, but once known as Mos Def, and Andre 3000, and just some of the most brilliant rappers in hip hop will just leave and just go do something else for 20 or 30 years, and they won't come back, and it's sad. And I feel the same way about so many of my favorite comic artists. I wish we had more work from Brendan McCarthy. I wish we had more work from Dave Mazzucchelli. I wish we had more work from just so many great comic artists. But you know what? The older I get, I'm learning to just be grateful for what we do have, because anytime someone makes a comic, anytime someone makes a movie, anytime someone makes an album, it's a little bit of a miracle with all the challenges of life that everyone's got to go through. So I just am trying to appreciate more work from the creators that I love, instead of being so greedy and like always wanting more. I'm just gonna love that we got work from Trevor Von Eden ever, that we got work from Brendan McCarthy ever, that we got work from just so many creators that we've covered and will continue to cover on this show. And that's why Comics Rot Your Brain is here, folks. We want to look back at these stories and not just give you a hagiography on these creators where we just get on here and suck their dicks for 2 hours and talk about how they're the greatest thing ever in the history of the world. We'll tell you what we think is fantastic about them, but we also want to tell you the stuff that we think is not great, and the stuff that we think is everywhere in between, because we actually respect the work and we respect the creators too much to just get on here and tell you that that they're perfect in every way, because they're not. And neither is Alan Moore, and neither is Grant Morrison, neither are my very favorite creators. No one is, but all the work is valuable. All this work that we cover on the channel is valuable. It all deserves to be reckoned with and talked about. So that's why we're here, to talk about all of it. And so to give a final bit of context here, I want to read the introduction to the stories of Milligan and McCarthy from that aforementioned Dark Horse collection. We're going a little bit backwards here, bouncing all around, but I thought there was a nice bit of just context for the British comic scene here in this introduction, which would be a good note to end on. And it comes from a writer who I'm not familiar with, named Mark Cardwell. I'm assuming he's English or British from the way that this is written. And he goes on to say in this introduction, "Hey, remember the UK in the 1980s? Times were grim. Margaret Thatcher dismantling the country's industrial heritage, the inevitability of global thermonuclear war, and even David Bowie releasing shockers like Never Let Me Down." Ouch. The Cold War death pact seemed quite pressing at the time, and by quite pressing, I mean omnipresent in popular culture. Raymond Briggs's When the Wind Blows, which, by the way, we also covered on this channel. Threads, which I think was a TV show in the UK about nuclear war. Frankie's Two Tribes video. I have no idea what that's referencing. Maybe Frankie Goes to Hollywood? I have no idea. Frankie's Two Tribes video. But when it wasn't the apocalypse, it was the post-apocalypse. The Terminator, the Mad Max films, Duran, Bloody Duran's Wild Boys video. What was a boy to do except retreat into his bedroom, listen to records, and read comics? Music was pretty gloomy too. Public Image Limited, Bauhaus, Echo and the Bunnymen, The Smiths. Hell, I didn't figure out that Morrissey and Nick Cave were really just taking the piss until maybe 1988. And comics could be pretty grim back then too, but they were great. The 80s comics revolution was just kicking off. The gloom of Alan Moore and Frank Miller didn't come out of nowhere. Their reality was a depressed mood, and their desire to create more realistic comics meant inserting this despondency into their work. But the comics that Pete Milligan and Brendan McCarthy were producing seemed even more realistic to me. If you somehow fluked into possessing a suit that gave you superpowers, you'd be the same guy, only in a skin-tight yellow outfit, preening in front of the mirror. You'd still slob around your untidy house, drinking beer, watching TV. In other words, to the young me, PARADAX was more believable and much more relatable than either Marvel Man or The Dark Knight Returns. Discovering PARADAX in Strange Days for the first time was the equivalent of watching David Bowie singing Starman on Top of the Pops. A flamboyant finger raised to the dreary denim world of fandom. Although there have been a multitude of media star superheroes in comics since, from Zenith to Kick-Ass, PARADAX was the first and the best. He was a genuine working class hero. His catchphrase was, "Hi, everything okay?" Here was the first example of something that would stand out through all of the comics that Milligan and McCarthy would produce together: their capacity for empathy. These comics are so mind-blowingly good. How the hell have they been out of print for so long? And so he goes on to talk some more about how excited he is. The Dark Horse is putting all this stuff back into print again in this hardcover collection from a decade plus ago, The Best of Milligan and McCarthy. You can find it on Amazon. It's absolutely brilliant. I highly recommend you guys all go buy it. Back then, he goes on here in the introduction to mention, back then there was a seemingly insatiable demand for more realism in comics, and some people saw Milligan and McCarthy's approach as running contrary to this demand. We want realism, not this surrealism. We want grim, not whimsy. And I think that's a pretty great description of what Milligan McCarthy were doing here. This is me talking outside the introduction. Yeah, they were surreal and whimsical comics. And I think that's what separated them from the grim and gritty explosion of the time. But it also is probably what made it really hard for these comics to find a foothold culturally, because they were running very counter to the zeitgeist of the time. They were running really counter to a lot of the stuff that was considered the signature, hey, comics aren't just for kids anymore. Check out Mouse, check out Dark Knight, check out Watchmen, check out, even Love and Rockets, or just a lot of the stuff that got attention there. It wasn't surreal. It wasn't whimsical so much. And it wasn't like this pop, lurid, crazy punk rock confection. There was nothing like this Milligan and McCarthy stuff. And that made it really hard to put it in a box. And frankly, it probably made it really hard to sell the material to anyone other than other creatives that were actually appreciating what these guys were doing and how next level and how bizarre it was. And so the introduction goes on to talk about various other things about the careers of McCarthy and Milligan, and then in talking about all the work that they did together and how it represents a secret history of the comics that followed them. These are the most influential comics that you never see credited as such. And I think that's a pretty fantastic place to leave this discussion of PARADAX and the brilliant Brendan McCarthy and the brilliant Pete Milligan. These guys are they're absolute legends in the comic scene, and everyone should be very familiar with their work. And I do hope that Chris and I will have a chance to return to discuss more of their collaborations together. I think we will probably take a look at Rogan Gosh at some point. I think that is considered by many to be perhaps the peak of their work together. Although I've got a real soft spot for PARADAX as well. And as you can see from the art in this video, PARADAX is a visual treat and a marvel. So props to Brendan McCarthy. And man, there was just so much great art and great writing coming out of the UK in that whole scene. And so many of those guys, like I say, it was such a small scene, and there were so many connections between it, from the Steve Dillon and the Brett Ewins and McCarthy, and just the connections with all these guys starting Deadline magazine, and Jamie Hewlett and Tank Girl, and and then you got the 2000 AD with the Judge Dredd, and you got the Simon Bisley, and you got Mike McMahon and Pat Mills, and just so many of these just absolutely amazing creators just bouncing around the UK there. And they would, of course, come over across the pond and revolutionize US comics thanks to Karen Berger and Dick Giordano and Jeanette Kahn, opening the floodgates here. And, American comics were never the same. So thank you to our friends in the UK for these extraordinary comics, and it's our pleasure to cover them here on CRYB. I'm sure we will do more of it in the future. Everybody in the comments, please continue to request other books that you'd like us to discuss, whether they be from the UK or from anywhere else, but we do tend to stick close more or less to the 80s. That's our bailiwick, but we do have exceptions here and there. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. We appreciate everybody. If you like the show, all we ask from you is please give us a comment. If you're the loquacious type, we read all the comments. We respond to all the comments. Means a lot to us. Good for the algorithm. That's what they tell us. And also, at the very least, even if you're the shy type, which maybe you are because you read comics, so whatever, a lot of folks are shy who read comics. At the very least, give us a fucking thumbs up. If you're still listening to the video at this point, for God's sake, it'll take you half a second, and that would help quite a bit too. So thank you, folks. Appreciate everybody, and sending you all good thoughts. And we'll be back soon. All right, go comics. Hey, hold the phone just when we thought the episode was over. All right, folks, I got one final addendum to add to this little discussion of Milligan and McCarthy's PARADAX. After I finished recording the preceding episode, all of a sudden, I couldn't stop researching, and I found this little blog post from 13 years ago that actually really efficiently and articulately made the case for the lasting influence of PARADAX. And since that's going to be the title of this whole video, I figured that would actually be a fine note to end all of this on. So I am going to be reading to y'all from a blog called Suggested for Mature Readers, which is a fantastic name for a comic book blog. For those of you who know, that was the lingo that DC went with when they made the highly controversial decision to start labeling their comics as such. But that's a story for another episode. But regardless, the name of this blog is Suggested for Mature Readers. And there is a post here from all the way back in 2013. And they're talking about PARADAX. So let's see what they got to say. The post is titled, "Let Us Share Our Insane Juices." Rereading PARADAX by Peter Milligan and Brendan McCarthy. In every medium, there are pieces of art ignored at the time that become enormously influential. The Velvet Underground are the obvious example in music. According, disputedly, to Brian Eno, everyone who bought their first album formed a band. Okay, hold on. Side note, that's actually super fascinating since I opened this episode with the same, perhaps apocryphal quote, which I was attributing to, I was attributing the topic or the subject of that quote to Big Star. And I swear I've heard people say that exact same thing about Big Star. But apparently, according to this blog, Brian Eno said that about the Velvet Underground. Okay, I'm starting to question the provenance or the origin of that quote. And where it comes from. Seems like maybe that's something that's applicable to a lot of obscure cult bands that went on to make a big impact, maybe retroactively. So that's kind of funny. But although I still feel like it's more apt to compare PARADAX to Big Star, because the Velvet Underground, I mean, yeah, they weren't massive, but I think because they were in New York and at the center of the whole art scene, with so much stuff going on around them, I feel like the Velvet Underground still had more of a major impact at the time on culture at large in New York, et cetera, than Big Star did. I feel like Big Star is still the better point of comparison. Anyways, aside from that, The blog post goes on to say, PARADAX is 32 pages long, 4 8-page episodes in total with 2 covers. It's been published twice. The first 3 episodes in Eclipse's miniseries Strange Days were reprinted in PARADAX number 2 by Canadian publisher Vortex Comics, the last episode in PARADAX number 1, alongside 2 unrelated strips. I could only find the first of those 2 comics scanned online with some effort. The second was kindly scanned and sent to me by fellow comics blogger Full Page Bleed. If you weren't buying comics in the 80s and you weren't on the cutting edge of the changes to the mainstream, you're unlikely to even have heard of it. There's DC implosion stuff that's better known than PARADAX. It's the definition of obscure. And yes, I would have to say that I would agree with that. Moving on. To say that it's been influential then seems counterfactual. How can something that nobody read have an influence? But as with the Velvets, it's not about reaching a mass audience. It's about reaching the influencers, the ones who then incorporate those influences into their own work and whose work then has an impact on the cultural mainstream. Okay, that's a fair argument about the Velvet Underground, I suppose. All right. Being specific, Animal Man puts a jacket on over his skin-tight costume in his Grant Morrison written miniseries in the late 80s. Oh man, here we go with Grant Morrison again. Now, this is really funny because I think what we're talking about here on some level is the thin line between, and this is me talking, not the blog, it's the thin line between inspiration and influence and ripping off somebody's idea. And where exactly does that line fall? And I think it's really hard to say because Grant Morrison has not tried to hide the fact that they are a massive fan of Milligan and McCarthy, perhaps, I would imagine. I know for sure I've heard Grant speak very lovingly, as I mentioned earlier, about Pete Milligan as a writer and how deeply underrated Grant believes that Milligan and Figueiredo's Enigma is. So it's not like Grant has run away completely from the idea that they were influenced by Milligan and McCarthy. But again, it's such a thin line. And obviously McCarthy was feeling kind of salty about it, the way things played out with PARADAX to ZENITH and now to Animal Man. It's the second time in just a few years that Grant Morrison created a superhero that wore a kind of a cool jacket over their skin tight spandex, which is something that kind of sort of didn't exist before PARADAX. So, you know, you could see where McCarthy might have been perhaps a little annoyed, particularly when he was the first one asked to draw ZENITH. And, and then ZENITH and Animal Man certainly went on to find much, much bigger audiences than PARADAX ever did, especially with the case of Animal Man. Now, of course, that's not just because Animal Man was wearing a jacket over his costume that the book was so influential. Animal Man was, I think, a work of genius on its own terms, regardless of that jacket. But all this stuff is just kind of fascinating to consider because these are the sort of things and the details and the nuances that the creators who originated these ideas would notice. And, it's exciting to see that you're having an influence on your chosen medium, but not necessarily if you're not being credited or compensated in any way, and the people who were doing the stuff that you did first are getting all the acclaim. So you could understand, honestly, I can understand everyone's perspective here, and I can understand Grant's perspective. Like, hey, I thought that looked fucking cool, so I wanted to do that, or it was an homage to PARADAX. And who knows? Who knows? I think there are arguments and discussions to be had on all sides of this, but that's exactly why this show here exists, is so we can have these kind of these ruminations and discussions in some kind of a public forum, because I think all this is worth noting and just having out there for posterity, because all these discussions eventually otherwise are going to be housed on websites and links that will be broken, and all this history will be lost, and it'll be just like ephemeral arcana from the distant land of the ancient comic book medium. And we don't want that. We don't want that here at CRYB. So we'd rather have these talks happening right here where they will stay forever, hopefully. All right, back to this blog post. Being specific, Animal Man puts a jacket on over his skin-tight costume in his Grant Morrison written miniseries in the late 80s. 5 years later, the Superboy, who makes up a quarter of the quartet replacing Superman after his death, who therefore stars in one of the biggest selling comics of one of comics' biggest selling decades, also wears a leather jacket over his costume. Fucking A, man. That's true. Superboy, after the death and then return of the death of Superman and the return of the Supermen. For those of you who recall and who doesn't remember that, that Superboy had that leather jacket on. Again, the influence of PARADAX. That is wild. I'd never made that connection before. Across the mainstream superheroes like Adam, across the mainstream superheroes like Adam and Eve, realizing their nakedness, dig into the wardrobe and get their jacket on. Okay, that's kind of funny. It becomes a defining look for the mainstream. It's still current. When Jim Lee briefly redesigned Wonder Woman, he put a jacket on her. Ooh, I remember that. That was not a good idea. No, not Jim Lee's finest hour. Where do all those jackets come from? From right here, from halfway through Paradax's second episode, where he ventures out onto the street in skin-tight latex looking like Kid Flash and is violently and viciously mocked by the streets of New York, called a commie, a honky, and a pedophile. He retreats to his apartment. His girlfriend sorts him out with a new jacket in the Michael Jackson Thriller style. He puts on a black t-shirt, ripped jeans, and red trainers, and his dignity is restored. One scene, one character, still bouncing around the echo chamber of superhero comics. Brendan McCarthy is one of those guys with a following. Those who've heard of him love him, while the majority of comic fans hardly know who he is. And to be fair, there's little enough actual work to point them to. He did Stacks for 2000 AD, especially Dredd. That's Judge Dredd, y'all. Back in the day, but was still finding his feet. He did Sooner or Later for the same title, a one-page-a-week satire that the younger me hated. He did costume designs for Grant Morrison's Zenith and Doom Patrol. He did covers for the first 20 or so issues of Shade the Changing Man, again, with good old Peter Milligan, of course, with Chris Bocciolo doing the art on that one for the interiors. McCarthy also did a great dream interlude in one of the first post-Scream issues. I think that was, again, part of the Shade, the Changing Man run. McCarthy did a couple of projects with Milligan, Rogan Gosh, and Skin that I hope to cover in the near future. And a couple of decades later, he's come back to comics with an issue of Solo, which was that very eccentric and awesome DC Comics anthology series that spotlighted solo creators all by themselves, like Chaykin, Bernay, Allred, and McCarthy, I believe, in the final issue. McCarthy also did a Spider-Man, Doctor Strange miniseries, and Saucer of Zilk for 2000 AD, which was later republished by Boom as a miniseries. This is an idiosyncratic body of work, to say the least, and there's very little to point to and say, there, that's Brendan McCarthy. Only the very recent stuff is still in print. This is before that Milligan McCarthy hardcover hit the streets. Peter Milligan, well, in the late 80s, when Brits had the drop on the comics industry, there was a system. Watch them evolve from raw to amazing in 2000 AD, then pick up whatever title they start on for DC and smile smugly when the American readers discover how great they are. Obviously, the person writing this blog is a British person. Peter Milligan came out, and they're not wrong, by the way. They are not wrong at all, because virtually the entirety of the British invasion of that time, even the lesser known writers like Jamie Delano and Peter Milligan were deeply brilliant, fantastic writers. So yeah, these writers coming over in the UK, British invasion, just to my mind, beat the pants off the American writers in that era. It was a crazy time. So back to the blog here. Peter Milligan came after Grant Morrison in that cycle, but before John Smith, who it didn't work out for. And it kind of didn't work out for Milligan either. He got his own title, fine, following the template of reinventing a company-owned character, and it ran for 75 issues from mature readers to Vertigo during that transition period where DC started labeling their titles, as I mentioned, and then Shade the Changing Man did ultimately become one of those flagship Vertigo titles with a very long run. Milligan was one of the first to write flagship characters with a run on Detective Comics, but he's always been wildly inconsistent. And that is something I would agree with. And for any of you who tried to read any of Pete Milligan's run on X-Men, where I believe Salvador LaRocca was illustrating it, yeah, not the greatest Pete Milligan comics, and didn't feel particularly inspired, as I recall. So Milligan, he's always been wildly inconsistent. For every bad company which I still need to read. And people in our comments keep mentioning that book in reference to Alien Legion, especially. But yeah, Bad Company. I really got to read that. For every Bad Company that Milligan has done, there's a Bix Barton. For every Enigma, there's an Electra. The quality of and seemingly the effort put into Milligan's work isn't reliable. And because comics have fans, not casual readers, you need to reward the obsessive. That's actually an excellent point. And it's something that someone like Alan Moore has always done to an insane degree, in my opinion, in terms of keeping that quality level so friggin' high. If someone seeks out that Cyclops and Phoenix miniseries and it's empty hack work, you've lost a fan. Okay, that is a particularly terrible example to use in this context, because if I'm not mistaken, that Cyclops and Phoenix miniseries that he's talking about, if it was the further adventures of, I'm pretty sure that was illustrated by Jean Paul Leon, which in fact means it was one of the greatest looking comics of that decade. There was another Cyclops thing, was it with Jean, where with Jean Grey, that Jean Ha also illustrated, another brilliant illustrator. But I think that this particular series that's being referenced here was the one illustrated by John Paul Leon. So yeah, it's a very bad example of Pete Milligan's wildly inconsistent work, because I don't care how inconsistent that story was, it looked fucking spectacular as John Paul Leon drew it. Really beautiful stuff. The point being, they're saying here, if someone seeks out one of Milligan's stories and it's empty hack work, you've lost a fan. The larger point there, obviously, is totally true. Yes. So Milligan does not have fans in the same way as Moore or Morrison or Miller. Talking about Frank Miller here, I believe, not Mark Miller, because they could not be talking about Mark Miller. Milligan doesn't have fans the same way as Moore, Morrison, or Miller, because you never know which Peter Milligan you're going to get. Fair. PARADAX feels like the underground striving to reach the mainstream rather than a mainstream comic with underground roots. It has that irreverence, the casual breaking of the fourth wall, the scene nodding asides like the rap and the breakdancers. It's got sex and it's got boobs, a big deal when superhero comics were uniformly chaste. It does not have drugs, that staple of the comic scene, but the villains play that role. Acid trip fantasies from the mass unconscious. And so then, I think what is that? What is that? One of the villains? No, I think it's a word that I'm just not familiar with. Erotomania. Someone in the comments, maybe let's look that up. I don't feel like looking it up right now. Erotomania. Wow, look at the big vocabulary on this on this blogger. Erotomania, haunting nihilism, an obsessive compulsive repulsion, and of course the shadow of the bomb that blotted out any imagined future in the 80s. The fears not of any underground scene, but of the straights, the squares, and the man. It's a remarkably conservative comic in that way, fighting for the same status quo as the Silver Age. Fascinating. It's conservative in a couple of other ways too. Most jarringly, here we go, in the unarguably racist caricature that is Mr. Chow. There isn't any excuse for him. Yeah, true. Sadly, I'm not a believer in beating up the past for not having the values of today, and I know of no other work in a sizable canon where Milligan or McCarthy have been insensitive about race. I don't know. Check out the character of Dutch and Screamer. Little weird. Masai Dreams, a short Milligan piece in 2000 AD. I remember dealing with race quite impressively. But Mr. Chow is an offensive, nasty toilet wall drawing, accent and all, ripping off the hero and interested only in money. The second adventure and the final chapter is all the better for barely featuring him. Yeah, and that's just so true, as mentioned earlier. I hate to even have to talk about that, and I hate that that exists, but, it's part of the record, and Pete Milligan put it in there, and so did Brendan McCarthy, and as much as those guys are super talented, amazing, brilliant creators, honestly, that's just disappointing. It's deeply, deeply disappointing, but, they were in their 20s, and we all do stupid and sometimes fucked up shit at any point in our lives, but particularly in our 20s, maybe. So, and I think also the thing about Mr. Chow is it's harkening back to an earlier time in comics where, racist caricatures of Asian characters, sadly, were the norm back during World War II and beyond. And that would have been the time when Milligan and McCarthy first grew up reading comics. So that, I'm not trying to shoot them any bail here, but they probably grew up reading a lot of offensive Asian caricatures in American comics in particular, and somehow that maybe that lodged in their collective cerebellum, and they didn't realize how fucked up the character of Mr. Chow was at the time. So it is what it is, but obviously it's bad enough that it's being commented on here in this blog post as well. So moving past that, it's also conservative in storytelling. There are at least 2 captions that begin, "Meanwhile," and the omniscient, buttoned-up, timekeeping narrator is there throughout, telling us where we are and what just happened. For most of the first 2 episodes, there's the framing technique of Paradax explaining his origin on a chat show, but for the most part, time is strictly linear. He may get laughed at and beaten up, but the hero is in no doubt about being a hero, following the Marvel path. I don't know about time being strictly linear. We got 3 different time frames we're kind of cutting back and forth between. I mean, just definitionally, time is not quite linear as we jump around here. But okay, whatever. So he may get laughed at and beaten up, Paradax, but the hero is in no doubt about being a hero, following the Marvel path. And by the end of the episode, by the end of episode 2, the police are expecting him to solve their problems in that lackadaisical way of police in any superhero universe. The structure is completely conventional. I think the concept is completely conventional. Conceptually, it is completely conventional, but the structure, narratively speaking, in terms of the way that the story is broken up, is actually anything but strictly completely conventional. The structure is literally jumping around through this trio of time frames. So I think that is not exactly correct, but whatever. I mean, maybe we're splitting hairs here. But no, what made Paradax unique and enormously influential was the content. McCarthy's extraordinary art, holding itself back but unable to stop the madness melting in around the edges, complemented Milligan's hip dialogue and the interactions of that tubular young couple, Al and Copper. If they'd married, she'd be Copper Cooper. That's funny. I didn't think about that. Copper Cooper. The sexual relationship that's shown was another sound of the underground bouncing into the mainstream. Soon, every young superhero would have a live-in lover clad in ripped neon workout gear and a like a prayer crucifix. Haha, Madonna looming large. More than anything, Paradax, this is a typo in the blog, Paradax was cool. He was a superhero that actual young people in the 80s might have aspired to be. Yep, 100%. Totally agree. Paradax looks cool as shit. Even still today, Paradax looks super fucking cool. The bad guys were fantastic. Literally. V2 pinheads, checkered body and missile arms, his angry little red face in green shades, a speck against his body, like a ska frontman playing a pro-war gig. He's a visual treat on every page, a villain who needs no secret origin or explanation because the look carries it all. And then the writer here goes on to describe some of the other Paradax villains from the Vortex issue that we did not read, or I did not read, so I'm going to skip over that part and get to the very end of this blog post. And here we go. It wraps up by saying... little comment on Ronald Reagan threatening to nuke New York, which apparently was inspired by some kind of real life thing, but I'm not going to get into that. Let's see. I've dropped mentions of the influence that Paradax had throughout this piece. To summarize, jackets on superheroes, live-in girlfriends, superheroes acting or being cool, demented villains with no motivation but arresting visuals, powers handed to ordinary guys, the use of influences from fine art, and of course postmodern irony. Titles that seem to me to bear Paradax's influence. ZENITH, Animal Man, Doom Patrol, First Hand, Second Hand, the Mike Baron Jackson Geiss Flash, where he earned a living and dated girls. Kyle Rayner as an ordinary Joe Green Lantern. Tank Girl, and Tank Girl's mix of action comic and domestic gags. The cool but senseless heroes and villains of the Image Comics launch titles, particularly Youngblood, with the whole kind of celebrity media super brat, proto-influencer kind of vibe that Rob Liefeld was going for there, which was also quite prescient, but it did indeed come after Paradax. So yeah, the cool but senseless heroes and villains of Image, and the writer goes on to say, I'm sure there are more. You can't argue Paradax changed comics completely. Its measurable impact, like its sales, was negligible. Maybe most of that stuff would have happened anyway, as new writers took over who had girlfriends and drank in bars. But at the very least, it was an outlier, something ahead of its time for a few years that still deserves to be remembered today. Amen. Thus, that is why we decided to cover PARADAX today